Hi, I'm Dan Bailey, and I'm an adventure photographer based in Anchorage, Alaska. I've been a full-time pro for 20 years, and I've spent much of that time exploring dramatic places and trying to capture images that I feel communicate the excitement and wonder of the outdoors. To me, adventure can be anything that gets you out of your element and makes your blood pump a little bit faster. Whether it's doing extreme sports or watching great light hit a beautiful landscape for a few magical seconds at the end of the day, it's anything that inspires you to get out there and explore on your own. I'm driven by the endless challenge of chasing those times when magical light and exciting moments converge. I love shooting still imagery because I'm fascinated by the power it has to ignite our imaginations and transport us to new places, even with just a small amount of visual information. As a photographer, I love the challenge of trying to include just enough subject matter in the frame to plant the seed of a story and then make the viewer imagine the rest. I want my viewers to feel like they're right there in the middle of the action. I want them to be able to feel the chill in the air and hear the wind blowing off the mountaintops when they look at my photos. My goal is to translate the excitement I felt at the time into a truly compelling image. I'm an avid cyclist, and in the wintertime here in Alaska, it's all about the fat bike. Up here, we use them to explore snow-covered trails and snow machine tracks out on the frozen swamps and rivers where you could never ride in the summertime. Winter biking allows you a special kind of adventure and quiet solitude you don't get any other time of the year. I'm also a bush pilot. I own and fly a little yellow Cessna 120 that was built in 1947. Since we don't have many roads up here, flying really opens up the number of places you can go exploring in Alaska. With my Tundra tires, I can land in the backcountry and on gravel bars, beaches, and frozen lakes. One of my favorite things to do with the airplane is to shoot aerial photos over the mountains. The light up here is so magical in the wintertime, and with the plane I'm able to capture it from some very unique vantage points up close as it's hitting these impressive snow-covered peaks and massive glaciers. I feel that my mountain aerials are some of the most dramatic landscapes I've ever shot, and they're certainly among my favorite images of all time. I love the simple traditional styling of the X series as well. Not only do they look and feel timeless, I have all the main controls right at my fingertips. This is especially nice when I'm trying to shoot photos while wearing gloves. And having used films like Velvia and Astia back in the day, the film simulations on the X series really bring me back. In many ways, I feel I've come full circle, and with all the creative options these cameras offer, I find myself more excited about my photography now than ever before. I think that focus is one of the most important aspects in creative photography, and being able to vary your level of focus within a shot allows you an enormous amount of latitude to vary your compositions. So focus plays a very important role in the process of photography, and when we're talking about composition, there are some very defined techniques that I want to touch on and talk about how those can affect your experience as a viewer, and so from that standpoint, how you can create photos to invoke certain emotions and certain response from your own viewers. When we look at a photograph, our eyes tend to lock onto whatever is sharpest in the image. And whether it's cultural training or pure instinct, our eyes and brain are conditioned to deduce that the sharpest, clearest thing in the photo is in fact the main subject. And in most cases, this sharpest thing not only introduces us to the subject, it brings us in and gives us a starting point by which we can jump off and start exploring the rest of the image. Now in photography, with our cameras and our lenses, we have an extremely wide range of focus and depth of field that we can apply to our subjects. But for practical purposes, I like to break these down into 3 different levels and 3 different categories. The first one is wide depth of field. Think the classic hyperfocal distance where everything is sharp from front to back across the entire range of the photo. Now we often tend to equate this approach to shooting landscapes, and rightly so. There's something really compelling about a grand vista where every single piece of subject matter all the way across the frame is sharp from front to back. Now I won't spend a lot of time on this one because you already know what that looks like. In fact, I just explained it to you. Here's a couple of image examples to illustrate. It's a look that we're very familiar with. And while a wide depth of field is a great technique for shooting landscapes, that's not the only situation where it can come in handy. You can use a wide depth of field to great advantage when shooting from the hip or shooting street scenes, or any time you're photographing and you don't have the time or the ability to precisely achieve sharp focus. Or maybe a situation where you're shooting from an awkward vantage point and you can't really see the subject. You can't really see the screen or the viewfinder well enough or manipulate the controls well enough to get that precise focus on your subject. However, if you're only shooting with a wide depth of field all the time, you're missing out on one of the most amazing and most creative possibilities that photography offers, which is selective focus, or shallow depth of field. In fact, a few years ago I was sitting in on a photo workshop as a guest instructor, and on the very first day, the lead instructor got up there, and the very first thing he talked about was hyperfocal distance, and he stressed the importance of this technique in landscape photography. Now personally, I felt this was a little odd, because I just think that stressing the importance of getting everything sharp all the time is really almost doing a disservice to your students, because, as I was saying, selective focus and shallow depth of field can be such a powerful creative technique in photography. And the result was that over the course of the workshop, some students spent the entire time and without making any kind of images that utilized shallow depth of field techniques. So, well, yes, while wide depth of field can be a great technique sometimes, don't forget about shooting shallow focus and getting very limited depths of field in your images. Now usually we think of shallow depth of field as being the ideal technique for shooting portraits and oftentimes sports and action, but really there's no reason we can't apply shallow depth of field techniques to just about any kind of subject matter and get great results. In fact, I think that shallow depth of field techniques allow you to put a huge stamp of personal creativity in your photography, because you're making the decision as to what to accentuate with levels of sharpness and blur in your photo. And of course, anytime you're making decisions about how to frame or compose your photograph, chances are you're going to come up with a more engaging, more powerful image. Mechanically, a camera lens operates in a very similar fashion as the human eye. But the difference is that we humans don't see in selective focus vision most of the time. In fact, the only time that we see shallow depth of field is when we're looking very close. However, just by the way our brain works, even if we're looking at something that's very close, we're almost too concentrated on what the thing is to notice the amount of depth of field and blur that's behind it. And even if we do stop to pay attention to that, it still doesn't look quite the same as it does in a photograph. And the beauty of using shallow focus techniques is that you can isolate your subject in very sharp focus against a blurred background. So from that standpoint, you can use the shallow focus techniques to actually build an interesting, very creative and very stylized story about the scene, instead of just featuring subject matter in the photo. I actually like to think of shallow depth of field effects as coming in two different categories. And I like to think of it this way because I feel that each one allows for a very different compositional style, and from a learning standpoint, this allows you to better identify which technique you're going to use as you're building your shots using shallow focus techniques. So the first one I like to call soft depth of field. And this is where the stuff in the background or the foreground is still very recognizable, it's just a little soft. We're still able to clearly identify what's in the background, but it doesn't detract from that sharp subject that's in the foreground. And this could be the other way around, as I just said. It could be your foreground and background that's sharp and blurry. And since you still have clearly identifiable subject elements in front of and behind the subject, this allows you to really build on those relationships and establish the connection between the different subject matter in your frame. And it can also create a sense of motion in your frame. You know, our eyes see the sharp thing, but they want to go back to the blurry thing and identify what that is. And so you keep coming back and forth between the two different elements, or the multiple elements. You could have 3 or 4 different subjects in the frame that all play off of each other. And each of those elements can act as a different visual target that establishes pathways for us to explore the image. But the key is that the subject matter that's in front of or behind is not extremely blurred. It's still fairly recognizable. It's just a little soft. And the other kind I like to think of as very shallow depth of field, or extremely shallow, you know, whatever terminology you want to use. And in this style, the background is simply a nice blurry wash of color or tone. There's no real identifiable subjects back there, so there's nothing really to pull our eyes. Our eye actually goes straight to the main subject, which is usually razor sharp against that blurry background. And that creates a very isolating effect. And in this kind of image, the main subject sits extremely prominently in the frame. In fact, it's probably the only thing that exists outside of that blurry background. And again, that background is just there for flavor and tone and to set a mood for the scene. Now with both of these techniques, you could utilize blurry subject matter in front of the main subject in such a way that it forces the viewer to look through that foreground to get to your main subject, which might very well be in the background. And this can be a really cool visual effect. I actually use this technique a lot in my photography. I like to bring my viewer into the shot, but kind of give them, they have to force themselves in past the foreground, which does help set the tone and the mood and the environment for the shot. So when they finally get to the main subject, they're full aware of what's going on in the frame. Now this is a technique I love to use, focusing on something that's not the main subject, because I think when it's done right, it can create some really interesting visual effects. It's essentially a play on that effect that I just talked about, where you're bringing your viewer into the frame by making them looking through subject matter, but it's done in reverse. Now this creates a really interesting journey for your viewer, because their eyes are going to lock right on the sharp thing, which is in the foreground, but that's not the main subject. Now the main subject's actually sitting behind that, and your viewer will be able to recognize that back there, and so they'll go there next. But they have to make that stop first because of the sharp subject matter that sits in front of it. So by the time the viewer gets back to the main subject, they've already had quite a bit of the story fleshed out, and now there's the rest of the story with the main subject. And I love this technique because it totally goes against the notion that when we look at a photo, usually the sharpest thing is the main subject. And in fact, a lot of times, if you look at a photo and the main subject is not sharp, then we tend to think that that's a failed photograph. It doesn't work. But this technique obviously throws that whole notion out the window. And as you can see, if it's done right, you can create some really compelling looks. So when you're using this technique and building your compositions, you want to make it so that the viewer's eye either goes straight to your subject, or the first thing that they do go to leads them straight to your subject. You don't want your viewer to go wandering aimlessly throughout the frame. You want to direct them to a certain extent. And so you want to have them come in on the initial subject matter, go to the second one, and from there, they're free to explore. But if you don't get that first hit and then that second main subject, your photo is going to lose its effectiveness. So that's where we'll end. Your assignment this month is to play around with different focus techniques, especially the two shallow depth of field techniques. Play around with those two creative approaches I laid out, the soft depth of field and the very shallow depth of field, and see what kind of effects you can have in your photos. And also play around with that technique where the main subject is not the thing in focus, it's something else in front of it that leads to the main subject. But again, regardless of what technique you're using, the number one thing to remember is that you're trying to build or accentuate the relationships between the subject elements in your frame. If you do that, you're going to go a long way towards making a successful image. Hi everybody, Dan Bailey here with some more Fujifilm camera tips for you. In today's lesson I want to dive in and talk about some of the ways that you can customize the look of your images even more in order to give them an individual and stylized look that matches your own creativity. I like to think of this approach as tweaking the film simulations. Now the thing with photography is that there's no one right way to shoot a photo. There's no one perfect way or one right method that we should use to reproduce any given piece of subject matter. And really, it's all just experimentation. Anytime you point your camera at the subject, you're free to use whatever creative ideas you want in whatever settings that basically excite you at the time and satisfy whatever creative whim that you might have in the moment. And nobody can tell you that whatever you did was the wrong thing. Sure, there may be some techniques that didn't quite work in order to create an effective photograph. And again, that's where it's all just experimentation. You come up with a specific technique and you try it out, and if it works, then great. You throw it in your bag of tricks and you can pull it out at a later time. If it doesn't work, you learn and you move on. Buried in the image quality menu of your Fuji, you can also find them in the Q menu, are a useful set of tools that you can use to alter the look of your photographs. These tools consist of highlight and shadow tone, color, noise reduction, and sharpness. And these are found on every single Fuji, no matter what model you have. If you have one of the newest models, the X Pro 3, the X-T4, and the X100V, then you also have a new clarity setting. Now I'll forgive you if you haven't used any of these tools, or if you don't even know they exist. And of course the camera manual doesn't really explain very clearly what they do, and even I didn't really know how to use them for a long time. I'd seen them in the menus, but I'd kind of ignored them for a while. But finally, after some experimentation, I got a feel for what they are, and now I find them to be very useful tools, and I use them quite often in my workflow. Now, the primary use of these controls is to give you a little bit more flexibility and creativity when you're shooting in JPEG mode. And since they allow you to adjust the color and the exposure and the overall look of your image, You can therefore get by in more situations without needing to revert to shooting in RAW. And of course, I know a lot of you are going to ask, well, why not just shoot in RAW all the time? Well, there's a couple reasons for that. The number one reason is that not everyone loves to sit at their computer and process images. As I said, the Fuji cameras produce incredible looking JPEGs with a high degree of color depth and clarity and sharpness, and in a lot of situations you can get by without shooting in RAW and still get wonderful looking photographs. There's also a big difference between the act of shooting photos and the act of processing photos. One of those is walking around in the world looking through your viewfinder, snapping photos when you see something, a piece of subject matter that excites you, and the other one involves sitting at your desk and sitting at your computer and sliding sliders and looking at the screen. And not everyone loves to do that. And obviously post-processing is a very viable activity within the realm of photography, and some people love to do it. But some people don't. Some people don't have the time for it, some people don't have the desire to do it. And that's perfectly fine. There's also an aspect of being able to look through the viewfinder or the LCD screen, manipulate the camera controls, get your autofocus, your exposure, any other adjustments, snap the photo, and walk away from the scene with an image you love, with a finished image, instead of walking away with a raw file that you have to go home and process later when you're far removed from the experiences and the emotions that consumed you when you shot the photo in the first place. Now, is either of these approaches right or wrong? No. If you enjoy processing raw photos, then that's fine. If you don't, that's great too. In my own photography life these days, I've come to embrace the challenge and the excitement of being able to nail the scene in the moment. And so I've embraced the Fuji JPEGs, and in fact, I probably shoot JPEG 75 to 80% of my time. And the thing is, I'm in love with the photos I get, and even when I need to do some minor adjustments, I can open the JPEGs up in Luminar, and there's plenty of latitude to do some minor tweaks and just make the images pop a little bit more. And of course on the Fujis, you can always shoot in RAW plus JPEG and have the best of both worlds. So anyway, let's explore some of these settings. Now all of these settings use a basic recipe. The adjustments go from +4 down to -2. And the rule of thumb is if you're using a plus setting, then you're always increasing contrast. And if you're on the minus side, then you're always decreasing contrast. And that works whether it's highlight or shadow tone, noise, clarity, or color. If you're using one of the newer Fuji models, you'll find that clarity actually goes from +5 down to -5, but it works the same way. We're going to start with highlight and shadow tone. I actually covered those settings in depth in my previous lesson, so I encourage you to go watch that video and see what those are all about. But very simply, highlight tone, or H-tone in the Q menu, allows you to bring down your highlights and kind of rescue the brightest areas of your photograph. It only offers you a little bit of adjustment. If you have a huge areas of blown out sky or water or any kind of specular highlights that are blown over the histogram, that are far tumbled over the right edge, you're not going to be able to recover that. There's only so much that you can save. And the same with shadow tone. But if your skies are just a little bit bright, you can bring those down and just have a little bit more detail in them to make the photo that much more appealing. With the shadow tone control, or S-tone in the Q menu, you're increasing or decreasing your shadow detail. For example, if you go +2 or +4 on the shadow tone, you'll actually increase the darks. You'll make the blacks even blacker. You'll add more contrast to the image. Conversely, if you use a minus adjustment, like -2, you'll actually open up the shadows. You'll lighten up the dark areas. And this can be a real boon sometimes. In fact, a lot of the times we shoot raw is to open up the shadow detail. Well, if you use the shadow tone control on a minus setting, you can do the same thing, even when you're shooting in JPEG mode. I think the shadow tone control is a very valuable adjustment, and I use it all the time. There are times when I'll use it to increase contrast and just get a harder edge, more contrasty, gritty look, and sometimes I'll go with a minus setting to open the shadows up and reveal more detail and reduce the contrast of my images. The color control is pretty self-explanatory. It increases or decreases vibrancy and saturation, just like a slider in Lightroom would do. So a plus setting gives even more vibrancy to your colors, and a minus settings reduces saturation and makes them a little more muted. So you want to make Velvia even more saturated? Go +4 and make it pop like cotton candy. Of course, the final look's going to be entirely dependent on what film simulation you're using at the time. For example, if you're using Velvia, very high saturated colors, you're only going to be able to desaturate that so much. And with a low saturation profile like Eterna or Pro Neg Standard, there's only so much you can bump those up. but at the same time you can pull those back and almost get a monochromatic look with very low contrast and saturation. The sharpness and clarity controls allow you to increase or decrease the level of crispness and overall sharpness in the photo, very much like those kinds of controls in Lightroom do. Now, each one of these settings that I just talked about can be very helpful in solving specific problems in your scene or just imparting a very different, unique creative look that you're going for. However, you'll start to see just how powerful these settings can be when you start to combine them in different ways. That's when it starts to get really fun. This opens the door wide open to a whole new level of creative control you can have with your Fuji cameras. Let me show you a few examples to explain what I mean and give you an idea of how I use these in my own photography. I love shooting Velvia. I'm so in love with that color profile. I'm just infatuated with the bold colors and vibrancy and the deep dark shadows it produces. I've shot a lot of sports and action over the years using Velvia, first with the original film and now with film simulations in the cameras. And I'm in love with the look that it produces. However, I don't just want to do the same thing all the time. I don't want all my photos to have the exact same kind of look. So one day I decided to do something totally different and experiment a little bit. I chose the classic chrome film simulation, which already has sort of muted colors and a little bit more tonality in the shadows. But instead of using the standard profile, I decided to tweak it a little bit. And I went -2 on the highlight tone, +1 on the shadows, -3 on the color, and +1 on the sharpness. And this gave me a really hard-edged, gritty look with lots of contrast, but low color saturation. And I thought it was really cool. I shot all day with this profile, and I just thought it looked awesome for the particular race I was shooting. It gave it such a different, unique look than I'd seen before in my imagery. It reminded me of pushing a roll of Kodachrome, where I would increase the contrast but desaturate the colors a little bit. There are other times where I'll use a film sim that has a very low tonality, like Pro Neg Standard or Eterna, and pull back both the shadow and the color, and that just creates an even more muted, soft look. And this could be great for portraits. It could be great for any kind of scene where you just want a very soft, very subtle look. Because not everything has to be super saturated, vibrant candy all the time. Sometimes you want to pull everything back. Sometimes I'll push Velvia to the max. This gives it the most bold, rich look possible with those gorgeous inky black shadows. Hey, sometimes that's what the scene calls for, right? It's all about the specific look and feel that you want for your own images. Going further, you can add even more components into the recipe. Want to push your creativity even more? Add additional brushes into the mix. In addition to the specific settings I've just mentioned, most Fujis have a grain setting, color chrome effect. You can even play around with white balance. Go a little bit blue or green on the white balance, and you can simulate that cross-process film look. Go a little bit on the orange and yellow side, and you've seemingly just aged your photos by a few decades. The newest Fujis even have that warm, cool black and white setting, which on the X Pro 3, X-T4, and X100V is now the monochrome color setting. And this allows you to add a very creative tint or hue or warm or cool color balance to your black and white photos right in the camera. Think about it, the options are endless. There's a huge amount of creativity to be had here. Whether you're simply using the tools to open up or darken the shadows, or tweak the colors slightly, or if you want to take those in bold directions, either way, the result can be a very individual and highly stylized look on your part. There's so much flexibility and creative possibilities with these cameras, and when you start bringing in and combining these settings, you open things up for yourselves in a huge way. There's also the dynamic range setting, the DR setting. This is kind of like an auto highlight and shadow tone control. You're letting the camera decide how much or how little contrast to apply to the scene. I haven't used these settings very often. I tend to keep my DR setting on auto, but I know there's a lot of people out there who do like to play around with this and get pretty cool looks. In my last video, one of the guys who commented shared with me one of his favorite recipes, and that's what you can call these, recipes, creative recipes that'll give you a very specific look. Anyway, the recipe he shared with me was classic chrome film simulation with strong grain setting, but -4 on the sharpness and -4 on noise reduction. And he said this recipe produces a very soft, classic film style look with a little bit of grain, but almost no digital noise to it at all. So I dialed that in my own camera this morning and I went and tried that in my garden, and here's what I got. And the really cool thing about this is if you come up with a recipe you really like, you can go into the Edit Save Custom Settings menu inside the Image Quality menu and save that to one of the Q menu banks. And you can even rename it and call it whatever you want. How's that for personalized customization? So not only has my film approach to photography saved me a lot of time, it's freed my brain up to focus on a lot of the creative aspects and creative ideas right on the spot when I'm on location. I'm more passionate about my photography than I ever have been in my entire life. And not shooting raw all the time, I don't feel like I'm giving anything up. I have so much creative control, and as I said in the beginning of the lesson, it allows me to walk away from a scene with a photo that I love, instead of walking away with a raw file that I have to go and process later in order to get a photo I love. And for me, that challenge of trying to nail it in the moment is huge. And that's what drives my photography in a big way these days. So in that way, I feel like I've come full circle with my photography, and I've gained every single advantage on my way back around the loop. And that's not to say that I don't ever shoot raw anymore. There are plenty of times where I shoot raw. If I'm faced with really challenging light, very high contrast scenes, or if I'm shooting an elaborate assignment. But for most of the work I'm doing these days, I'm shooting JPEG, and I'm playing around with these creative controls inside the camera, and I'm walking away from my scenes with an image I love. And again, for me, that's everything. That's the process. Because in the end, I love shooting pictures more than sitting at my computer processing them. So I encourage you to try shooting with this mentality and experiment with some of the approaches that I've talked about in this lesson, and see what it does for your own creativity and your own photography. For even more in-depth instruction and inspiration, you'll want to check out my best-selling ebook, X-Series Unlimited. It's almost 400 pages. It tells you everything you need to know about how to get the most from your Fuji cameras. So thanks for taking the time to watch this lesson. I hope you found it useful, and I hope it inspires you to push your own photography and your own creativity in new directions. Hey everybody, Dan Bailey here. It's a sunny May evening here out at the Knik River Bar, about 40 miles east of Anchorage, Alaska, where I live. It's my first time out here in months. I haven't come out here since last fall. Anyway, here's my mode of transportation to get out here, my faithful little Cessna 120. She's built in 1947. It's got Tundra tires on it, and it's just a really fun little airplane. It's kind of like a Subaru with wings. So it gets me and my gear to the places where I can go have adventures. And as you can see, this is the landing strip that I came in on, right back behind me. It's pretty long, it's about 1,800 feet in total, but there is a pronounced dip in the middle, so you want to make sure that you've already landed and have your speed controlled by the time you hit that middle spot, so you don't bounce, and that's kind of hard on the landing gear. Anyway, as you can see, it's a really wonderful evening out here tonight. It's pretty quiet. I'm the only person out here for miles. And so I wanted to do this little virtual tour and bring you out with me and see what it's like for me when I come out here and kill a couple hours with the camera. So I hope you have fun on this little virtual tour. It's a little bit cooler out here than it was in town today. It was probably 60 degrees in Anchorage, or close to it, at least in the sunshine. So not too bad though. Kind of average spring evening weather, so I'll take it. So here we are down by the Knik Glacier Lagoon. This is the little body of water that's in front of the glacier. The glacier's out there. You can see it in the sunshine out there. This is where the icebergs that break off the glacier live out the rest of their days before they finally melt, and then get evaporated and fall as snow and precipitation back in the mountains, which turns them back into glacier material. So it's pretty fun to be out here, as you can imagine. There's a lot of photographic opportunities. I come out here numerous times throughout the year. And that's one of the really fun, magical things about going to the same place, revisiting locations, is oftentimes they're different than the last time you were there, and they change. And so that's one of the fun adventures of nature and outdoor photography. In addition to photographing the icebergs, I love these reflections. I've photographed this particular reflection numerous times. You might recognize it from some of my older pictures. But I like these juxtapositions of the mountains reflected in the water with the little icebergs and little ice chunks that are floating nearby. And there's so many different size and shapes of ice formations. There's really a limitless amount of fun that can be had out here with the camera. So like I said, I spent a lot of time out here, and it's always a fun challenge to try to do different things and come up with different compositions, try using different lenses, use different film simulations and color palettes. Anything to kind of push your creativity and vary the compositions so you don't always come home with the same thing. So I've got my Atlas pack here. This is my favorite adventure pack. It's got a great camera insert and a lot of space on the inside of the pack for jacket, water, food, emergency gear, anything like that. So I'll show you what's in my bag, what I typically carry out here. So I'm going to flip it over, and then we'll just undo the zippers, and you can see the camera insert. And so there I've got my X-T4 with a 35mm lens on it, and I've got a 55-200, my 14 2.8, some batteries. I've got my 50mm f2, which is one of my favorite lenses, and then my X100V, which I almost never leave the house without that thing. It's a lot of fun. And then cards, a buff. So yeah, there's everything I need for an evening of photography. As you can see over here, we've got some nice reflections that are in the sunlight. You can see the distant mountains being hit by the sun. And so those are being reflected in the lake. And so I'm going to see what I can do with those. I'm going to put a long lens on, put that 55-200 on, and see what I can do with that. So as you can see, I isolated these little ice chunks, these little tiny icebergs, in front of the reflected mountains. I started with Velvia to give me nice, rich, bold colors, and then I switched to Eterna Bleach Bypass, which is like the opposite of Velvia. It pulls all those colors back, adds a little bit of dynamic range just to keep the excitement and the drama high, so it doesn't get too boring. And then I switched to Classic Neg, which is another film simulation that I love. It also gives kind of a similar feel to Eterna Bleach Bypass. Yanks some of the colors back and the saturation, but it boosts the tonality. Those three color palettes really do give you a wide range of tonal possibilities. And I like the contrast that each one delivers to the shot. For this scene, you can see I'm concentrating on this area over here. And again, starting with Velvia, which you can see just really rich, bold colors. And there's something that really cool about Velvia shooting ice and snow in the shade. And when you contrast that against sunlit stuff, you just have this really beautiful deep blues against the warm sunset colors on the mountains. And then again, switch to Eterna Bleach Bypass for that kind of antithesis of Velvia, that color that's almost monochrome. And then for the third one, I went with Classic Chrome. I do like the way that Classic Chrome renders the colors of ice. So I've used that quite a bit photographing out here. Got some really cool reflections out there. I'm playing with those a little bit, using Velvia again. Isolating that one little bump on the iceberg. You can see all the detail in there, and then against that little strip of golden mountains back there. I really like that look. And then instead of focusing on the iceberg, I can focus on the mountains back there and just get all that crisp detail, those golden peaks. Of course, I got to shoot a wide angle, so I pulled out the X100V. With its little 23mm f2 lens on the front. Here I've switched to Classic Neg and cranked the clarity way up. I think this gives a really gritty look. Just kind of a nice contrast from the other stuff I'm shooting this evening. And the light's progressing nicely. It turning out to be a pretty good evening. Here you can see that one last peak getting hit by the sun. This is what we live for. This is why we do this. We can catch these magical moments of light that happen around us. Pretty tranquil evening. You can see why I like it out here so much. I'm all alone out here. There's nobody around for miles. It's kind of fun to have this solitude. You don't get that very often. And it's just a bush plane ride away. So it's 10:27. There are 10 minutes left till sunset. So I'm going to pack up my gear and hike up over the hill and see if we can see some last light. And here we are, back at the little yellow plane. So I'm just going to do a little wind check. It's pretty calm, but I'll just pick a few leaves up, chuck them in the air. And you can see they blew to the left there, so there's a little bit of wind coming off the glacier. So we'll take off into the headwind. So I'll taxi down the strip, turn around, and then take off going that way. So should be a pretty smooth takeoff, I think. So I'm all buckled in. It's about a 45-minute flight back to Merrill Field. It'll probably be 11:15 when I get home. It'll still be light. It doesn't get dark this time of year. In fact, we won't see dark for about 3 more months. So that's kind of the payoff for all the hard, laborious work we've done in the wintertime, is that we get these great, endless summers with midnight sunsets and really no darkness. So anyway, I want to thank you for joining me on this little virtual tour of the Knik Glacier. And please subscribe to my channel, check out some of my other videos. Have fun with your cameras out there, and I'll see you next time.